We're here in the last few verses of chapter 15 and the first few verses of chapter 16. And it's a small chunk. We're not doing a whole lot today. It actually means that you might actually get to your small group on time. Amazing. But it's worth our walking slowly through this space, because the world rushes us through so much. And I mean, we're almost 2 weeks past Easter already, and the world rushes us past both our celebrations and our grief. It rushes us past where we're stumbling and wishing that we could have a little bit more time. And it rushes us through the things that we wish we could savor a little bit longer. So we're looking at Mark 15:42 through 16:8a. I'm going to read the whole thing, get it in front of us. I'm going to have to skip past some slides in order to do that because of the way I set the PowerPoint up this morning. So forgive me. You might get a little whiplash, and then I'll come back and we'll look again. So it was preparation day. That it is Friday, the day that Jesus was crucified on the cross. It was preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath. So what's really interesting about Judaism is that as important as the so-called high holy days may be, Judaism has maintained for centuries that the most important day always is the Sabbath. And there are times when a high holy day, because they are on a lunar calendar, so they don't have a fixed date for things the way we have a fixed date for Christmas. It's kind of like the way Easter moves around for us. All of the days of celebration and mourning within Judaism move because they're on a lunar calendar. So sometimes high holy days occur on the same day as the Sabbath, which just sort of like makes it even bigger. But even when you're in the midst of something that's big and important and high and holy, like Passover, the Sabbath is something of such importance that it always has to be honored. And it ultimately was that Jesus was dying on the eve of the Sabbath that forced the women to leave him unanointed and unwashed, if you will, and be buried, which then required them to come back a couple of days later. So it was a preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, and I think you know that the Sabbath begins at evening and ends at evening, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus's body. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When Pilate learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Okay, you get a quick glimpse of where we're going to hang out for a little bit this morning until I can get to the rest of our scripture. Okay, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus's body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for the Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right, let me get us back to where we were. Sorry. So rude. Okay. My head keeps my shoulders keep disappearing in the white. I'm a floating head in your PowerPoint. Oh, you thought I was scary anyway. So, all right. So we mentioned that it's the Sabbath. They have to prepare. It's really interesting when you think about the identity of life as a Jewish woman. It is governed by the ebb and flow of every week, and then it's governed by the ebb and flow of every season. So there is this weekly day of preparation for the Sabbath, and most of these women were not even in their homes. They're from Galilee, and yet they have learned to celebrate the Sabbath wherever they are. And they've learned to be obedient to the guidelines and rules that the rabbis have set around the Sabbath. And as a result, even the death of Jesus and even their own grief didn't stop them from doing what needed to be done. Those of us who know and love women who lost their husband when their children were young know that the children still need to be fed. The children's clothes still need to be washed. The house still needs to be cleaned. They still need a routine. And as arresting as grief can be, we are still alive, and those whom we care for are still alive. And when our identity is rooted in the rhythm and routine and requirements of the Jewish tradition and faith, then even grief is not an excuse for abandoning what is believed to be God's commandments for us. So that means that even as Jesus is dying on the cross, preparations for the Sabbath still have to be made. Now, this is a really interesting thought if we hang out in it just a little bit. It's interesting for a couple of different reasons. It allows us to think about God in a couple of different ways. If we maintain the rhythm of our daily and weekly and monthly and seasonal lives in the midst of our grief, it's a statement of faith that God is bigger than our grief, and that life is still life, and it ought to be cherished and celebrated and embraced and wanted. On the other hand, when we go through the motions of our lives based on what we think are rules, then it can cause us to see God as uncaring, unfeeling, demanding, and disconnected from what we are experiencing. But if we look at the biblical witness, especially within the Psalms, we are made aware of a God who is intimately acquainted with our ways, our rising up and our lying down, intimately acquainted with our emotions. When we weep, when we are joyful, when we are celebratory, when we are struggling, when we're frustrated, when we're feeling insecure, when we're feeling hopeless. So in that case, going through the motions of our lives, especially our spiritual lives, is a way of reminding ourselves that our God is present in the midst of everything that we're going through. And so we celebrate the Sabbath because the Sabbath remains a gift to us even in our grief. The Sabbath remains a gift to us even in our disruption. The Sabbath remains a gift to us because it's part of our identity. Those are the people who rest, who actually take time and space to sit in rest, because it's a way of connecting with the God who rests and who invites us to rest in him. So as oppressive as it could feel to read through this text that the women were still expected to prepare for the Sabbath even while Jesus was dying, the Sabbath in its deepest intention is a gift to you and me that invites us to rest from our labor and to rest in whatever emotion we are in the middle of with God. And I wonder about us and how much we rest and whether or not we're any good at resting at all. I know some of you have been surprised by work over the last year and how the boundaries have become very blurry, and how it just seems like you could work all the time because you've got a computer, and we've all discovered that digital world exists. And look, here we are having Bible study, which we celebrate, but it also means that there's no excuse for not doing work, right? This past weekend, our oldest son, Scott, was in a production of Into the Woods at Furman University. And this time he was in it in high school and he played the baker. This time he got to play the big bad wolf and Cinderella's prince, which was so fun. He's got quite the swagger, let me tell you. And seeing him play Cinderella's prince was very fun because he's just arrogant and full of himself. And he's not in real life, which is sweet, but it was fun to see him on stage. But the production was on Friday night and on Sunday afternoon. And so we went, we arrived in time to have an early dinner with Scott and his girlfriend, Frances. And then we staked out our space in the amphitheater at Furman, right by the lake, and laid out our blanket and our chairs, and we're ready to see their production. And it was so fun because the amphitheater doesn't really have backstage. I mean, you can see the backstage, and as a result, you can see the actors preparing to come on stage, and they did such a great job of being in character even when they were technically off stage because they could be seen, and that was really fun. Plus, everybody in the production is a vocal performance major, so the voices were amazing. But Scott didn't have any requirements related to the production on Saturday. And Eric had found this gem of an Airbnb that is it's almost like a tree house next to the main house of a 16-acre property. And it was just perfect for us. It had a couple bedrooms, and my friend Robin came down and stayed with us. And then there's like this football field, a field below where the place was, and it's all part of the property. And it was like, you guys are welcome to the whole property. So it's like big old football field we played cornhole and kicked the soccer ball and threw the football. There's chickens. So we checked out the chickens, and there's a garden, and then there's a creek. And there's a 2-rope bridge over the creek, and there's a zip line over the creek. So it was just like, come and play. And then a big fire pit. And so Saturday we played. We sat on a blanket or in chairs on this football-sized field. Finn was walking on a branch that broke, and he ended up in the creek. We did the zip line. Leif learned that he's a chicken whisperer, and and it was just, I don't remember the last time that we gave ourselves permission to just play and not have any responsibilities, to just rest and enjoy being together. And that is the intention of the Sabbath. The intention of the Sabbath is to be with people, to be in community, and to rest from the demands, the shoulds, the thinking that we're supposed to's. So it's not a bad thing that this part of the story begins with the preparation of the Sabbath. As disruptive as Jesus's crucifixion and death was, that the Sabbath was still observed is a demonstration of the fact that God is still in control. Well, as evening approached, all labor is supposed to cease. And so Joseph of Arimathea, not wanting Jesus to remain on the cross, went to Pilate and asked for his body. So I think we mentioned this last week, but it's worth repeating that crucifixions were public events, often occurring on the side of a road. And the reason being was so that you would be disincentivized to do whatever it was those who had been crucified have done, because this is what your fate would be. It's a deterrent against crime. It's one of the reasons why there was a sign above Jesus's head declaring what the accusation was against him, so that any passerby would know why this man had been crucified. And the tradition was not to take a body down after the individual had died, but to leave it there and allow the buzzards to attack it. It was awful. And it was all intended, it's an issue of control, right? The Romans are occupying this land, and they're giving some degree of autonomy to the people who live in this land. But don't mess up, because if you do mess up, the consequences are dire, and you're going to be left out there for everyone to see what you've done and to keep them from doing it themselves. We somewhere along the lines got this picture that Jesus was crucified on a hill. There's actually not a hill mentioned in scripture. And as I mentioned, most crucifixions happen along the road. And remember, this is not a superhighway kind of road. It's a road that people walk on. There are no motorized vehicles. It's the first century. There may be some carts, there may be some donkeys, there may be some horses, but for the most part, it's people walking by, and they're walking by these bodies that are hanging from these crosses, that remind you that you are an occupied people who are required to live under a certain set of rules. And if you don't, these are what the consequences are. Knowing that cultural truth, we therefore can read Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus's body, as a genuinely bold move on his part. I mean, first of all, he's Jewish and he's going before Pilate. Second of all, he's a prominent member of the leadership, which could put the leadership in jeopardy, or could cause Pilate to be angered that someone would be so bold as to come against him. And it is not tradition for the bodies to be removed from the cross. So that he would go and ask, it really is a very, very bold move on Pilate's behalf, or sorry, on Joseph of Arimathea's behalf. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. Betsy Rembert writes, it reminds me of lynching in the South. Whites wanted everyone to see what would happen if Blacks didn't follow the rules. Betsy, that's a really powerful reminder. And it's true. And you're right, it's true. It's also a hard truth to accept, isn't it? Because we would love to demonize the Romans and declare that they were somehow barbaric as compared to us, right? And yet you're bringing up a historic example that occurred within many of our lifetimes. So thanks for bringing that to us. I appreciate it. So Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead, and summoning the centurion, that's the Roman guard, he asked him if Jesus had in fact already died. When Pilate learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. Now, it's worth our asking, why do you suppose Pilate did this? I mean, he very easily could have said, no, we don't take bodies down from the cross. I think there's two reasons. Anybody want to take a stab at it? I think the first reason is that Pilate has learned enough about Judaism at this point to appreciate that within the Jewish tradition, people are buried within 24 hours. And he was honoring that tradition. I think the second is it demonstrates Pilate's discomfort with this whole thing. He washed his hands of it, but he didn't. Because we can wash our hands as much as we possibly can, but it doesn't necessarily get rid of the stench that we may have had our hands in, right? And I think that Pilate's willingness to give the body of Jesus to Joseph of Arimathea within a window of time that sort of surprises people that he was already dead. I think that is a demonstration on Pilate's part that he really didn't want to have anything to do with this man's death, that he tried to wash his hands of it, and that by allowing Joseph of Arimathea to take Jesus off the cross, then Pilate doesn't have to be reminded of it. He doesn't have to walk past Jesus dead on the cross. He doesn't have to continue to encounter the story. It ends the story for Pilate. The other piece of Mark's telling here, bringing Pilate back into the story and bringing the centurion back into the story, is that it is a Roman governor and a Roman soldier who confirmed the death of Jesus. And by doing this, Mark gives that we could sort of call it an untainted witness. It's not, obviously it's not, because we know that Pilate is not untainted in it. But what it does is it says, look, this is not just a claim that's made by Jesus's followers, because this way, Pilate's confirmed that he's dead. The centurion has confirmed that he's dead. Joseph of Arimathea has confirmed that he's dead. So he's dead. As opposed to, if it had only been Jesus's friends, then maybe they were making it up. Maybe they took him down from the cross before he was dead, and maybe it just took him 3 days to recover enough to be, able to get out of this tomb that he was placed in. It gives validity. We could even call it sort of like extra communal validity. So it's outside of the community of believers that Jesus is declared dead. And by doing that, it allows for his being alive to be validated in a way that it wouldn't have been validated if it was only the Christians. I know they're not called Christians yet, but if it was only the followers of Jesus who were the ones who were making these claims. So when Pilate learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. And then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. And there were witnesses to what he was doing. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. All right, so to pivot just a little bit, not, stay where we are, but maybe not be quite so heady. I just want to share with you some pictures. And I want to share with you, you could call it controversy, or you could just call it is what it is. But there, as I mentioned last week, is an argument about where the tomb actually was. Um, and in some ways, it's kind of funny that Christians are battling with one another as to where the tomb was, because the fact of the matter is whether the tomb is in the space that is encompassed now by the Holy Sepulchre, or the tomb is in the space that is the garden tomb, the tomb is empty. The tomb was empty on Resurrection Day, on Easter, on Sunday, and that's the important thing, that we did not find the bones of a first century man in either of these spaces. We found emptiness, and that is the thing that's really important to our faith. But because we're really good at arguing with one another, let's argue a little bit more. So what you're looking at now is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I love the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, although it always kind of surprises me a little bit. The domes that you see in the photo on the left are, there's actually two of them. There's two domes, a big one and a smaller one. You can see the cross on the top of the one that's near, but behind it, you can see there's another little cross at the top of that dome, and that's the second dome. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is kind of insane. I mean, it is this huge space, and we're about to go inside, so you'll get to see some of the interior of it. But it covers a lot. It covers a lot of space, but it also covers a lot of story, and we'll look at some of that. What's surprising always to me when I go is that the picture on the right is the front door. You know, we think of our cathedrals and our churches, and they have these big, ornate, gorgeous front doors that really say, this is the front door. And every time I look at this on the right, I think, this doesn't look like a front door. Like, I can't see the dome when I'm going in there. It doesn't really look very churchy. And yet that's the front door, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Holy Sepulchre means holy tomb. Yeah, you know that, tomb. Okay, here's another picture of the front door. Let's see if I can make that. I don't know if y'all can see that 5 of 20. It's kind of in the way, but I can't move it. Again, another view of the front door. This time you can see the dome above it. Over here on the right, where you see the scaffolding, for a long time, the Ethiopians lived on the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because there was a fight going on about whether or not the Ethiopians should get to have space inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And even though they are a people whose identity as Christians is older than anybody else's, they have always been treated like second-class citizens. And so for the longest time, they had to be on the roof. Finally, they have space inside the building, but part of that scaffolding that you see is creating space for them. It's just a bizarre place, and there's more bizarre about the story for me to tell you. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the tomb. Now, this is not what the tomb would have looked like in Jesus's day, but today, if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, then this is what you see that encompasses the space that is believed by the Orthodox tradition, which is the large majority of Christians, to be the place where Jesus was laid after he was crucified. Of course, none of this was encompassed inside of a building at the time, but it's part of what makes it a little hard, especially for Protestants who are not as symbolically oriented, who are not as kinesthetically oriented to our faith, but who are more intellectually oriented to our faith. We want a space that feels like a grave, that looks like a grave. We don't want a space that is like encompassed inside of a building. Nevertheless, it's gorgeous. Though on the right, what you see is that dome that you saw actually has a skylight in it. And so that's a sunbeam that's coming down from the top of the dome and shining onto what you see on the right, which is the tomb itself. And I have a couple more pictures to show you. Here's a more like panoramic view of it. So if you are standing in line to go inside of the tomb that is inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, then this is the view that you get. And there's a door, and you go into the door. And once you get in there, despite how big and ornate this is, it's very small. And they usually let about 3 people in at a time. And you can sort of get in and you can kind of turn sideways and you can get down on your knees to kneel at the slab of marble that is there to represent where Jesus may have been laid. And then to get out, you kind of have to back out. I mean, you can hardly even turn around inside of it. So it's odd that it's, so big and ornate, but the space inside is not at all spacious. If you look, you see the sort of red and flame-like things that are sort of encompassing this space in the middle towards the top. Those are both candles and incense burners. And also part of Orthodoxy is that in worship, we want to engage all of our senses. And so in the Orthodox tradition, incense is typically burned in worship as a way of engaging your senses, your sense of smell, even your sense of taste, because sometimes you can kind of taste incense. But scripture says, taste and see that the Lord is good. So the Orthodox tradition has cultivated a form of worship that allows for our senses to be engaged. So we see beauty, we hear beauty of song, we smell the beauty of incense burning, we taste the Eucharist. All of these things is to engage us as physical incarnate beings. I mentioned the front door of the Holy Sepulchre never really kind of looks like a front door to me, but it has quite an interesting story. On the right, if you kind of peer inside the doors, you can see that there's a sort of something that looks a little bit like this. That's called the Stone of Unction. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre are the last 5 stations of the cross. And last 4 stations of the cross. And if you walk in these doors and you look to your right, there's a narrow little staircase and you go up that staircase, and that's the station 10 and 11. And station 12 is the Stone of Unction. And it's believed to be the place that when Jesus was taken down from the cross, his body was laid on this slab of marble. And it's there that Joseph wrapped him in the linen cloth. And then he was carried to the tomb, which is just over here to the left. One of the reasons why they believe that this is the site of his crucifixion and burial is because that little stairwell that I just told you about that you take to get up to the 10th station of the cross, well, it's built over a slab of rock that has a crack through it. And in that crack is a red seam. And so the tradition is that is where the cross was sort of hammered into the ground. And when the earthquake occurred, sort of like all of creation groaning at Christ's death, that crack from where the cross was went all the way down into the earth, and Jesus's blood trickled down through that cross, through that crack. So that's one of the reasons why this is considered to be the place of Jesus's death. I mentioned to you, and I think I've shared this with you before, so I won't spend too much time on it, but here's the front door again of the church. It's closed. And then the picture on the right is just, I turned around and took a picture of the plaza with my back to the front door. So just so that you can see, because this plaza is actually a gathering place. It's kind of like the narthex of the church. It's a gathering place for pilgrims. And there are 2 times a day that any of us who go, and we're all going, right? We're going to get this trip to the Holy Land off the ground and we're going to go together. This is the place where people gather early in the morning, waiting for the doors of the church to be opened, and they gather at night, waiting for the church doors to be closed. Oh my gosh, I forgot to look this up. I can't remember the name of the war that took place that in some ways is related to the doors of this church. And I couldn't remember it last night either, and I totally forgot to look it up. Anyway, there was a skirmish that actually started in Bethlehem between 2 opposing factions of Christianity, the Armenians and the somebody else's. And I was not a history major, you guys. Usually I do a better job of preparation on this one. I forgot. I'm sorry. Anyway, all of this to say that This was when there wasn't a separation of church and state. So if there was a problem in the church, it often got meted out by heads of state. So two heads of state went to war against each other because they couldn't agree when mass could be held in the holy sites in Jerusalem, because they were arguing with each other about who got to hold mass where and when. And ultimately, a war broke out. And one of the resolutions of that war breaking out was in Bethlehem, a schedule was made, and the Armenians get to have mass at the main altar during this hour, and the Latins, which are the Catholics, get to have mass at this hour, and the Greek Orthodox get to have mass at this hour. And that was how they worked it out in Bethlehem. Well, in Jerusalem, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the way that the conflict took place is that the different Christian factions were locking each other out of the church. And by locking each other out of the church, then they weren't able to go into the church and celebrate mass at the holy altars that are inside of it. And there are multiple altars. Well, the resolution to that was to give the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to a Muslim family. And for centuries now, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is locked and unlocked every day by a Muslim family. Generations of this same family have been passing the key to the church down from generation to generation. It's actually a really amazing and beautiful story when you think about it, because this, for Christians, is one of the most sacred spaces in our tradition, especially for those who find meaning in sacred space. So every night, this Muslim family comes and locks the door to the church, and you have to climb up a ladder because the lock is really high. And it has become something that's part of the ritual of being a pilgrim in the Holy Land, is to go and watch the church unlocked. And then part of my ritual has become getting up really early in the morning and walking the Stations of the Cross, which then ultimately lead to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and getting there just after the doors are opened so that you're among the first inside the church and it's not as crowded that way. And it's just this, it's so weird. It's so weird to sit here to say to you guys, yeah, everybody gathers and watches the door get closed and locked, but it has become this tradition. And as you can see, it's really crowded and people take cell phone videos of it. And it's profound to think about that as much conflict as there is in the world, we have found an odd peace in the old city of Jerusalem. And one of those ways that we found that peace is by a Muslim family opening and closing the doors to one of the most sacred places in our tradition. Similarly, as much conflict as there is between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's Israeli guards who stand watch over the Temple Mount, which is it's actually the third most sacred space in Islam, in all of Islam. So it's a very fascinating city, and it's one you can definitely get lost in. Just a quick, see if it'll work. It worked last night. Doesn't look like it's working today. Whoops, what did I do? I did something. This is supposed to be a video, and I don't know why it isn't playing, because it played last night. All right, so now we'll go to the Garden Tomb. The Garden Tomb is a Protestant site. It's held in trust by a British group. I mentioned to you last week that there are actually they're missionaries from all over the world who come and spend anywhere from a month to a year leading tours in the Garden Tomb, because they really see this as a oh, that's what I did. It's okay. Thanks, Lisa. Lisa's sending me a note why my video isn't playing. It was just a little panorama of what you've already seen inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So Garden Tomb is what, as Protestants, make us feel like, okay, yeah, this is really what I thought it was going to look like. Okay, I gotta, hold on 1 second. I have to make my chat go away because it's covering my arrows. All right. So this is the Garden Tomb. It looks so much more like a tomb, right? There's a door there instead of a stone, but that's a close up. So just to orient us, here is a map of the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. Now, the blue lines are modern walls. That's what is there today. The black lines are the ancient walls, or the first wall, if you will. The second wall, first wall, second wall is pre-Nehemiah rebuilding the walls, pre-Babylonian exile and post-Babylonian exile. Regardless of the first wall or the second wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built on a site outside of the walls. And that's important because that's part of the biblical witness. And then the Garden Tomb is also outside of the city walls. And it's just outside the Damascus Gate, which is a very highly traveled route. So it wouldn't surprise us at all for a crucifixion, especially one as high profile as Jesus, to happen along a high profile road. And that was the road to Damascus. If you go today, these blue lines make up the walls of the old city. And so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today is inside of the walls, and the Garden Tomb is outside of the walls, but that's not really relevant because those walls were destroyed and rebuilt. And just to orient yourself, the big gold dome of the Rock, which is the Muslim site, that's what you see over there on the right where it says temple, because it's built on the Temple Mount. It's built on the site of Solomon's temple. So I think I mentioned to you last week, we know that Golgotha means skull because there was a rock formation that looked like a skull. And there is still a rock formation that looks an awful lot like a skull, and it's next to the Garden Tomb, outside the Damascus gates, outside the city walls. And it's so outside that it's actually a bus station. And if you look closely, over there on the right, where you see a building and it has little windows, that's actually a hotel that I've stayed in. And I stayed in one of the rooms that looks out on the bus station. And arguably there, it looks out on Golgotha as well. This is the inside of the tomb through that door that I just showed you. Okay, I couldn't get this video to work last night. I definitely can't get it to work today. But this video, I'm going to send you in the newsletter. It's a 13-minute video that takes you on a tour of the Garden Tomb by one of those missionaries. And so it's actually a wonderful presentation of the gospel that you don't necessarily know or need to know. I mean, you know the gospel. You don't need to hear it again. But what you might enjoy is that part of the video also includes some much older photography of the area that allows you to see it before it was built up and became a city and became a bus station. So back to our text. When the Sabbath was over, and the Sabbath is over at sundown on Saturday night, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus's body. So the minute they were able to be freed from Sabbath observance, there are markets that open back up on Saturday night, and they went and they bought what they needed so that very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. So these are two different events that took place that Mark has put into one sentence. When the Sabbath was over, which is at sundown on Saturday, they went and bought what they needed so that when they woke up the next morning, they would be able to go and attend to Jesus's body. Now, why do women do things very early on the first day of the week? Well, a couple different reasons. One is all throughout Scripture, early in the morning is a way of indicating righteousness. The Old Testament uses it over and over and over again, and it is always to indicate righteousness. But as much as this could indicate and may indicate righteousness of these women, it also indicates that they either were already afraid as they were going, because they didn't know what they were going to find, because they didn't know who they would encounter, because they didn't know who might stop them, because this was a really bold move on their part. And I love that Mark takes the time to tell us that when the Sabbath was over, they went and bought the spices so that early the next morning they could go and do what they wanted to do to honor Jesus's body, because they knew exactly what they were doing. This was well intentioned, but it wasn't necessarily without risk, and it definitely wasn't without fear. And they had thought through it, but as they were on their way to the tomb, they asked each other, okay, so we got the spices, we've got each other, we've got what we need, we've got the willingness and the boldness to go and do this, but who's going to roll the stone away? Now, I want to say this. The fact that women are looking to prepare Jesus's body in this way, that's not unusual. This is within the work that women do. We've become very sanitized with regard to death. Other people take care of death for us. When those whom we love die, if they die in our homes, we call the funeral home to come and take their bodies and either cremate them or prepare them for burial. But we don't do that ourselves. Some people have stories of having washed the body of a loved one after they've passed, as part of engaging in that ritual, as part of engaging in the reality that they are no longer in their bodies. But if they die in a hospital, it's the hospital that takes care of that and takes care of that transportation. And if we see their body again, we see their body in a casket, having been embalmed and prepared. And in that way, we've removed ourselves from the reality of dying and the reality of leaving our bodies. But it wasn't frightening for the women to be doing this preparation. It was frightening for them because they were doing it in this unusual circumstance. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. I love even the phrasing of that. They were head down. And we're head down for a couple different reasons, right? Sometimes we're head down because we've got a task to do and I'm going to put my head down and I'm just going to get through it. My poor sweet 10-year-old yesterday was complaining about just, having been falsely accused by his teacher of not doing something that he had done. And then there being some conflict, not involving him, but involving other people. And he just said, I'm just going to put my head down and get through the rest of the year. And I'm like, oh, yeah, no, that's not okay. You're 10. You shouldn't have to put your head down and get through the rest of the year if you're not being treated properly, especially at a Catholic school that we're paying for. So we know that phrase of putting our head down and just getting to it. We also know the phrase of having our heads down because they are pulled down, weighted down by grief. It is really hard to look up in the middle of grief, my sisters. When we find ourselves in that really hard, difficult, dark place, it is hard to lift our eyes. It is why the psalmist says, lift your eyes to the hills. From where does your help come? It comes from the Lord. But it's hard for us in grief to do that. So these women, they may have been approaching it as a task they needed to get done, so their head down in that way. They likely were approaching this as a grief-filled moment. They loved Jesus. They loved Jesus as much as any of the male disciples who were named loved him. It wasn't a bad kind of love. It was they loved him. And he was dead. And then Mark says, but when they looked up, where does our help come from? It comes from when we look up. They saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Well, Mark doesn't come right out and tell us that he is a angel. And remember where we started this gospel? Jesus doesn't have a birth narrative in this gospel. So all the encounters with angels that we have in the other gospels, we don't have at the beginning of Mark with that narrative. We have John the Baptist. And and so we don't have Mark telling us full out this was an angel, except that this was an angel, because that's what is understood when it's a young man dressed in a white robe sitting to the side and alarming us. Because what happens when we come into the presence of angels? We're afraid. Their first words are always, don't be afraid. And it's worth noting that the sitting on the right side, it has to do with not sitting in the place of Jesus. So there's no bait and switch that's happening here. There's no like, oh, do we have the wrong tomb? Even though he was alive and speaking, but sitting to the side. And what that also indicates, whenever we have that statement of sitting at the right hand of, or sitting to the right side of, what we have is a servant position. This angel is a servant of the story of Jesus, of the resurrection, and is there for a specific purpose. So we have our last slide, our last phrase, don't be alarmed, which is what angels always say, except they always say it and it never changes. We're always alarmed at the fact that they are here. Do not be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Like, take a beat, take a breath. Look, he's not here. You can put your hands on it. You can get all the way in here and see that he's not hiding in a corner. There's no secret passage. There's no box that he's inside of. He's not here. But after you've done that, go tell his disciples and Peter. Oh, isn't that interesting? Why does Peter get separated from the disciples? He, that's Jesus, is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. All right, so let me hang out here for just 30 seconds. Peter has denied that he is a disciple of Jesus 3 times on the night of Jesus's crucifixion. And Mark tells us that it's women who were still at the tomb, or who were still at the cross when Jesus was declared dead. Mark tells us that it was women who watched Joseph of Arimathea take him off the cross, wrap him in a linen cloth, and saw where they laid him. And it's women who are going to prepare his body. Now, I'm not saying it's women as in they're better and the men are not. I'm trying to talk about the fact that Peter, believed to be the sort of most robust of all of the disciples, is not there. And we can't help but wonder why he isn't there. And I suspect that Peter has banished himself, that Peter is in deep, deep grief, because that's what Mark tells us he's experiencing when he realizes at the second crowing of the cock that he has in fact denied Jesus. And so you can see Peter going, how can I be counted among his disciples when I denied him? And what Mark relays is that this is a word of compassion that Jesus has left with the angel to communicate to the disciples and to Peter, so that it's very clear that Peter is still counted among the disciples, is still wanted by Jesus, and ought to be among those who go on to Galilee to meet Jesus. And we end this passage and our time together this morning with, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. They didn't say anything to anybody because they were afraid. Fear does sometimes silence us. And there's a lot to be afraid of in their context. afraid that they won't be believed is a really big one, because women were not considered reliable witnesses in the first century. Their testimony didn't hold up in court. They weren't given the honor of being able to bear witness to things. So the fact that the angel revealed this and commanded to the women that they go and tell is so opposite of their cultural experience that it's possible that some of their fear came from the fact that they didn't think anybody was going to believe them. It could also be rooted in the fact that maybe they wanted to just do this for themselves and for Jesus, but didn't necessarily want everybody else to know that they'd gone to the tomb to prepare his body. Maybe they were afraid that Joseph of Arimathea would be offended because the linen cloth that he wrapped Jesus in somehow wasn't enough in their opinion. And so they wanted to, so there's a long list of maybes as to why they were afraid. Part of their reason for being afraid is that everything else that they had seen Jesus do, actually, every command that Jesus gave after healing people was go and don't tell anybody. And when he was coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration and Peter, James, and John were asking him about what had just happened, he said, don't tell anybody. And we have this whole narrative throughout the Gospel of Mark of witnessing these powerful things that happened at the hands of Jesus. And the response was, don't tell anybody. And now the most powerful thing that we could imagine, a crucified, beaten, condemned man dying on a cross and buried in a tomb with a stone rolled in front of it, is resurrected. And now they're supposed to tell somebody. Every time in the earlier part of the gospel, people were told not to tell, they went and told. And here they're told to tell and they don't tell because they're afraid. Probably because they don't really know what being risen entails, what it means for them, what it means for our future, what it will be like to encounter him. And that's kind of scary. So this is where we end today. They didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. And it's honest and it's real and it's part of our own lived experience of being afraid and frankly being a little afraid of our faith at times, of the power of God at times, of what it is to go before the Lord in prayer and ask for things at times. There's fear. And yet what does God say? You don't need to be afraid with me. My perfect love, it's not something to be afraid of. Perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love invites you to live without fear. Perfect love is a gift that I give you so that you don't have to be afraid. But we're still learning, and so are the women, and so are the men. And so we carry on. So I'll see you next week.